Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the buffet in this beautiful old building of the Dutch Senate. And now it's time to welcome you at the opening session of this international conference on the ideal parliament. My name is Carla van Balen, and I'm director of the Dutch Center for Parliamentary History, and I'm one of the organizers of this conference. The idea itself for a series of conferences on the subject of parliamentary cultures in Europe was born in Germany some years ago. The first conference took place in Berlin, 2010, the second one in Prague in 2011, and now it's time for number 3 here in The Hague. As you know, The Hague is the home city of government, parliament and monarchy. To introduce the other organizers briefly to you, there is, first of all, Andreas Schulz. Andreas, where are you? There's Andreas Schulz, Director of the Kommission für Geschichte des Parlamentarismus und der politischen Parteien in Berlin. And Andreas deserves the credits for coming up with the idea for the international conferences. And then there is Renier Aert. Renier, where are you? Professor of Political History, University of Nijmegen, who will chair the morning session tomorrow. Next, there is Henk de Velde, sitting here, Professor of Dutch History, University of Leiden, who will be the moderator tomorrow afternoon. And last but not least, Margriet van der Steen. Yes, there you are. Coordinator of the EUPALNet, the European Information and Research Network on Parliamentary History. And she did all the practical work for this conference together with Jurgen Brunes. And Jurgen, where are you? There's Jurgen. We are very happy indeed that the Dutch Senate allowed us to use that beautiful plenary meeting hall for our first evening. And the other speakers of this evening will tell you something more about its history. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you our first speaker, the Vice President of this House, Professor Dr. Kim Putters. He's a member of the Senate since 2003 for the Social Democrats, and he's about to leave this House. To accept another very honorable function. From the middle of June onwards, Professor Putters will be the director of the Netherlands Institute for Social Research. As a matter of fact, his speech tonight will be whether his final speech or one of his very last speeches in his current function as Vice President of the Dutch First Chamber. But for now, he still is a member of the Senate, and he will speak some words of welcome to you, Mr. Putters. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind words and for the possibility to speak here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you a warm welcome here in the Dutch Senate. And it's not often that I get to see this historical room filled up with such great historical knowledge. And I do not want to be disrespectful to my colleagues, but it's a warm welcome to you and a pleasure to have you here tonight. It's truly an honor to receive you all here and to host the opening from what promises to be a very interesting and thought-provoking conference. What better place to open this conference than here, in this historical building that is today the home for the Dutch Senate and has housed Dutch democracy for nearly 400 years. We like to consider ourselves as relatively recent inhabitants in this building in a long tradition. For this plenary hall dates back to 1655 and was built for the states of Holland and West-Friesland. In order to build this hall, the houses of the stadholders, a medieval function that can be described as the hereditary head of state, were torn down. Thus, space was created at this magnificent square at Binnenhof, which translates as the inner square. We call it the inner square for a reason. We say that this country is run from 1 square mile on which both the Houses of Parliament are situated, as well as the Prime Minister's office, and this tradition dates back to the 13th century. But let me refer a little bit more to this building and its rich history. For it has been the home of the stadholders Maurits and Frederik Hendrik, but also to the King's stadholder William III and his English wife Mary Stuart. In 1806 it was the home to King Louis Napoleon, the first king of the Kingdom of Holland. When he left for Utrecht in 1807, and I don't know whether this has got to do something with The Hague or it's not a very pleasant place to stay, I leave that up to you. But an official proposition was submitted by the Treasury to tear down the inner court, since it was in such a bad state. Luckily for us, this proposition was rejected due to the historical importance of this site. If it had been accepted, the Dutch parliamentary history could have looked a lot different than it does now. After the incorporation of the Batavian Republic with France, this very room was used to inspect army recruits. In that period of time, a great amount of artifacts unfortunately were lost, most of them never to be found again. But the historic background of this building can still be found in its stained glass windows, its hand-woven tapestries and its oil paintings. For me, they form a constant reminder that the decisions that are made here today do not stand on their own, but form part of something greater, the history of Dutch democracy. This sense of tradition, of reflection, of the bigger picture is to a large extent the core business of the Dutch Senate today. We are not full-time but part-time politicians. We all have positions in Dutch society. Among the senators there are doctors, entrepreneurs, lawyers and mayors. For one day a week we form part of a crucial system of checks and balances between government and parliament, and also within parliament itself. Democracy is never a given, and we need these checks and balances in order to remain transparent and critical. When a bill is dealt with in this House, we test it for legality, for practicability and enforceability. And in the current Dutch political situation, that is proving to be more and more complex. For the first time in decades, the reigning coalition does not have a majority in this Senate. They hold 30 of the 75 seats. And this means that for every bill, a majority has to be found through consulting, debating and persuading. Some say that this damages the position of the Senate because it puts the various parties, opposition as well as coalition, in an increasingly political position, away from what I just explained as the core business. One can also argue that it allows the Senate to fulfill its role as chambre de réflexion even better than before, because a majority of senators in favor of a bill is never a given. This debate about what really the effect is still goes on, as does our legislative work in the Senate. The scope of the Senate's work is not restricted to national issues. For national policy is partly also European policy, and European policy is for the greater part national policy. The Senate realizes that and has strived for many years now to stress the important role that national parliaments play in strengthening European cooperation and policy. Since 2009, European legislation is directly put on the agenda of our parliamentary committees, and this means that the position of the Senate equals, in this respect, with that of the House of Representatives. In addition, by hosting conferences, expert meetings and hearings, the Senate sparks debate in and with society and improves its knowledge on European dilemmas. The Senate has also created a specific website on which its European-related issues are publicized. In a way, this helps us to be accountable for our role in fortifying the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. National parliaments play an extremely important role in bringing European citizens and European institutions closer together. It is the task, we believe, of our national parliaments to bridge the gaps between, on the one hand, irreversible trends of European centralization, and on the other hand, the sentiments of uncertainty, resistance and unbelief among the people the national parliament represent. If people do not feel at ease, the worst thing parliamentarians can do is look aside or step back. But international cooperation and the role that national parliaments have to play in this stretches further than Europe. The Interparliamentary Union is a good example of democratically chosen parliaments working together to preserve peace and to promote a worldwide dialogue. The Interparliamentarian Union works for cooperation among peoples and the firm establishment of representative democracy. As a chairman, I've been that in the past 6 years on behalf of both chambers of parliament. As a chairman of the Dutch delegation in the IPU, I have seen firsthand that even difficult subjects such as human rights can be addressed on a global political level among parliaments and without ministers or prime ministers. By the way, the focus on international cooperation is certainly not recent. I go back to this wall. To prove this point, I would like to direct you to the images that are painted on the ceiling. When this room was created in the mid-17th century, it was specifically requested that the room expressed a strong international connection. If you look up, you will see people from all over the world looking down on us, with a sense of curiosity. If you look closely, although it's a bit far away, but if you look closely, you can recognize the Polish, the Persians, the Turks, the Spanish, the Mexicans, the French, the Italians, the Russians, and the Germans. And they even say in the middle, it's the English stepping in the hall, and that's always when you have to watch out. I can tell you something more about that after the meeting. Since the 17th century, and specifically now in this age of growing globalization, it has become more and more important that countries realize that they cannot live in isolation, and that the major issues such as climate control, safety, and the battle against poverty cannot be tackled on a national level alone. And this brings me to what I think is one of the great merits of a conference like this you have these days. Not only does the conference offer the chance to look back on parliamentary history on an international level, but it also offers a chance to learn from that history and to look to the future together. And I must say, I hope our government hears this message as well. Since the theme of this conference is the ideal parliament, perhaps you will allow me to briefly touch upon that subject. The word ideal is explained in the dictionary as reaching an imaginary standard of excellence. There is a quote from Winston Churchill that I think applies here. To improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often. Perhaps an ideal parliament is in a way always an imaginary standard. As long as we change, we are always improving. And if we change often, we can hopefully reach that standard of excellence, or at least, according to Churchill, we will. The Dutch Senate has certainly tried its best to change, since we are the first parliament in the world that fully functions on digital data processing. We no longer have stacks and stacks of paper, but we can find everything we need on our iPads. And on your desk, and there was just a question about it in the back, on your desk you see a small tin pot. Well, nowadays we have this saying in this house, we are from inkpot to iPad. This is one of the ways in which our Senate is trying to constantly evolve and improve ourselves. Today, and it was already said, today is one of my last speeches as first Vice President of the Senate. I will be leaving my position here in a few weeks now, but to have formed part of the Dutch parliamentary system and therefore of its parliamentary history has been a remarkable experience for me. I am glad to see that history is researched and examined carefully. And for now, I wish you a very interesting and, as I said, thought-provoking conference, and I hope it attributes to finding out what really makes an ideal parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patters, for your kind and interesting and encouraging words. And we consider it as a great honor that you have decided to stay with us tonight to attend the rest of the program. Now, ladies and gentlemen, time has come to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Emeritus Professor Dr. Joop van den Berg. Professor van den Berg is the Nestor of Dutch parliamentary history. Only a few weeks ago, he published an impressive new book on the subject, titled, in Dutch, De Eerste 150 jaar, in translation, The First 150 Years. The book deals with the period between 1796, the year in which the first real Dutch parliament was established, and 1946, when the first post-war free elections were organized. For the attentive listener, I just said the first real Dutch parliament, but of course, the question what makes a parliament a real one will be part of the discussion on this conference. Anyhow, Jo van den Berg has been, among other things, professor at the universities of Leiden and Maastricht. He used to write columns on political issues in a Dutch newspaper. And last but not least, in this context, during the 1990s, he was a member of the Senate himself for the Social Democratic Party. So he is on familiar territory. Jo van den Berg, the floor is yours.
Dear Mr. Deputy Speaker of the House, dear Mrs. Chair, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I take the opportunity, being a former member of the House of Parliament, this House, to introduce you to the hall you are in now and to say furthermore a few words about, for my part, the first chamber in the Netherlands, which meets in this room, as you have heard, once every week. Maybe you will hear some information already given by Dr. Cutters, the Deputy Speaker, but I realize that 90% of education consists of repetition. So some messages you will recognize. It will help me, that's the other reason, to come to the main issue of my speech, which is the theme of this conference, the idea of Parliament. The decision to build this hall in 1651, which was the initiative of the new Grand Pensionary, John de Witt, has been an important political decision in the first place. Building a meeting hall for the States of Holland in the midst of the premises of the inner court and just between the living apartment of the Orange family and their court chapel, which doesn't exist anymore, should demonstrate that the supreme authority in the Republic from that moment onward lied in the hands of the burgher governors of Holland and not anymore in the hands of the Prince Stadtholder. Shortly before, the State of Holland had taken the decision not to appoint a new Stadtholder as successor to Prince William II, who in August 1650 had died of smallpox at the early age of 24 years. He had left behind his pregnant widow. But in order to leave her apartment, she and her son, the later Stadtholder and British King William III, day by day were forced to pass the meeting hall and be confronted with the burgher governors walking in and around the hall. And on top of this new hall was designed by Peter Post, who was already well known as court architect, educated in the studio of Jacob van Kampen. Post had been also the architect of Huis ten Bosch, the small but luxurious palace of the late Stadtholder Frederick Henry, a few miles north of The Hague. But not only was the Stadtholder's family thus deprived of her house, her privacy and her authority, but also of her architect. The paintings in the roof, that was spoken about, it above you, show the self-image of Holland, which in 1615 was at the zenith of its political significance in the world, with Holland belonging to the most important powers in the world of the 17th century. And you can see representatives of all other powers in the world looking down and eager to be informed about the decisions being taken by the States of Holland, led by their Grand Pensionary. In those times, political decisions, by definition, were about war and peace. And you can see them in allegoric form painted in the two big mantelpieces behind you. Alas, they are partly hidden by the two ugly balconies built during the 19th century as galleries for the audience of the first chamber, which then started to meet in this room in public. Interesting to mention are also the relatively small entrances in the four corners of the hall. Some you don't see anymore. Not only to keep the temperature on a decent level, but also as a demonstration of Republican modesty. At the end of the 18th century, this meeting hall was seen as the symbol of the Ancien Régime, at least by a new political elite which had the ambition to reform the Dutch Confederal Republic and to transform it into a democratic and unitary state. But after the so-called Batavian Revolution of 1795, which got the military and political support of post-revolutionary France, this hall and the meeting room of the States General, a bit further away now at that side, in this building complex, were left and closed down. The new National Assembly started its meetings in 1796 at the opposite side of the inner court build, in the formal ballroom of Prince William V, Holland's latest stadtholder. The National Assembly, later called Tweede Kamer, Second Chamber, would stay there until it got a new assembly hall in 1991. After the Napoleonic era and the restoration of the Netherlands as an independent unitary state and a new kingdom at the same time, in about 1850, this hall was used until 1848 as the meeting room for the assembly of the new province of Holland, later called South Holland. Provincial government from the 19th century onwards was a decentralized part of the unitary national state. It nevertheless saw itself as the hereditary of the former sovereign owners of this hall. But after 1848, they had nevertheless to share a room in this part of the inner court with the institute, which was called First Chamber in the Constitution since its foundation in 1850, but without really being a first chamber. As you may know, the international constitutional language calls the directly elected chamber, the real people's representative, the first chamber, whereas the aristocratic or federal representative, like the House of Lords in Britain or the Senate in the United States, is called second chamber, but not so in the Netherlands. The Dutch First Chamber, more or less set up as a copy of the House of Lords, is in international terms the second chamber. Until 1848, its members met behind closed doors in the relatively small room of the former States General, where nowadays the Council of Ministers has its meetings. The Liberal Constitution of 1848 prescribed the public character of the First Chamber, and that was the main reason to relocate the chamber in this old hall of Holland's government. Lacking an extended nobility, like in England or in Germany or in Belgium, the membership from 1848 onwards was limited to the highest taxpayers of that time, sort of substitute monetary nobility. This hall, originally built as demonstration of bourgeois government against the power of the Orange family, eventually became the meeting room of an institute that at least started as a very royalist supporter of the new kings of Orange. To a certain degree, you can see this in what I call, I've always called, the war of images in this room. The portraits of its original owners, the leaders of the Republic, are reduced to small portraits in the roof. See that in several places, where only experts can trace the faces of our most famous pensioners. But almost intimidating is the big portrait of King William II, who started himself the process of making a modern liberal constitution in 1848, more in fear of his own existence than out of conviction. After that, he wanted to stay with the newly chosen members of the First Chamber as a sort of Lord Protector. Its new members were no advocates of the old Republican regime, which had given birth to this hall, and they accepted the permanent presence, a rather dominant presence, of William II through its huge portrait. The revenge of Orange was complete. Let's step over, ladies and gentlemen, to political business now and say a bit more, after what Dr. Putters already has said, about the actual place and role of the First Chamber within the Dutch constitution of today. With the exception of the right to initiate new laws and to amend them, First Chamber has the same rights as the Second Chamber in the Netherlands. It can dispose of all the means to call the government to account, and it is allowed to veto every legislation and every budget proposal put before it. But whereas the Second Chamber, the real people's representative, is permanently in session, which makes membership practically a full-time job, the First Chamber meets only once a week on Tuesdays. It limits itself to debating law proposals in committee and in plenary session, and it discusses the annual budget of every ministerial department. But to make things easier and to have the budget decided upon right in time, the First Chamber often decides to vote the budget of a certain department without discussion before Christmas, and then afterwards in the new year, the Chamber will have a so-called policy debate with the Minister at some moment during the ongoing parliamentary year. Without very interesting discussion, but without any press on balconies. The Minister is then already authorized, as you may expected, to spend the money. Interesting to mention is that the Dutch First Chamber, like most of its sister institutes in the European Union, is putting a lot of energy, was also already said, in investigating and influencing European legislation, not only to produce the so-called yellow or orange cards. It does so with much more energy and commitment than its colleagues in the People's Representative, which, like in many countries, continues to define itself as the real center of the world. Making use of an intelligent monitoring system developed by an outside group of academic experts and a small group of very competent internal staff, the First Chamber is able to discover what is relevant for the Dutch citizens and where critical scrutinizing is needed. And all this in a very early stage of European decision making. Like in most second chambers or senates, the Dutch First Chamber is more interested in European legislation and more inclined to active participation in this legislative work than its counterpart at what here is called the other side of the inner court, the Second Chamber. The paradox is that this critical participation may well go together with a more pro-European mind. But that's something which can be said of most senatorial chambers in the European Union, the British one included. The central problem of the Dutch First Chamber has always been its rather unclear position in the Dutch constitution, leading to sometimes heavy discussion on its legitimacy, from the day of its foundation in 1850 until today. Practically all great statesmen in Dutch political history since 1800 have been very critical towards this chamber and have preferred its complete abolition. In the beginning, it had something to do with the fact that the chamber was meant to make room for the Belgian nobility in the newly formed United Kingdom. The southern Netherlands have preserved a much more extended nobility than the former republic. As you will know, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, which only lasted 15 years, united the once Austrian Netherlands and Principality of Liège with the Dutch Republic. The earliest critics of the First Chamber were representatives of the southern bourgeoisie, who blamed this ménagerie du roi, as they call it, because of its systematic conservative resistance against any reinforcements of the people's representative. The very limited reform of the constitution after the Belgian secession in 1840 didn't put an end to this chamber, as you might have expected, but it saw its existence purposely continued thanks to King William II, who wanted it to be preserved for his personal protection. Roughly the same happened in the revolutionary year 1848. The great reformer of those days, the liberal professor of constitutional law in Leiden, Johann Rudolf Thorbecke, would have preferred to abolish the first chamber, calling it without basis, without purpose. He failed already within the Constitutional Committee under his chairmanship, which had to prepare a new text. The second chamber didn't make things better. Thorbecke's conservative Protestant colleague, Guillaume Groen van Prinsteren, agreed with him, calling the chamber a bad copy of an English model. But nevertheless, a majority of conservatives and pragmatic liberals were not prepared to render support. Most constitutional reforms until today have given enough reason to restart a debate on the existence of the first chamber, but every time without success. Instead of eliminating the institute, the framers of new constitutions since 1980 only forced the chamber to accept a more democratic composition, although it continues to be indirectly elected until today. The criticism of 200 years has never stopped, neither in public opinion nor in constitutional science. If the chamber takes its own political stand and is prepared to repeatedly veto legislation, which is already accepted by the second chamber, it risks its sheer existence by being so stubborn and obstructive, as it's called. If it doesn't, and it keeps politically quiet, it risks to be blamed for being superfluous and too much a duplicate of the second chamber. Since the last decades of the 20th century, the first chamber has looked for a position which would make sense in the shadow of Dutch politics. It did so by not wanting to recapitulate every political decision agreed upon by cabinet and second chamber. It concentrated upon the constitutional and legislative quality of proposals put before it. And next to this, the chamber started to give a judgment on the chances of effective implementation of any law proposal in discussion. And this approach seemed rather successful, and it helped to give the chamber a better image. I mentioned already the European activity of the first chamber, which could be seen as complementary to the activities of the other side. But the first chamber was only able to take such a modest as well as authoritative position on the basis of political majorities in the first chamber, which would equal to those of the second chamber. Since 2010, we have got Sedor and Weiser. In that year, both majorities started to diverge, as had been the case already during the first decades of the 20th century. In the old days, around 1900, the consequences had been quite damaging to consistent political decision-making. Eventually, they have worked to the detriment of parliamentary authority, the first chamber in particular. The volatility of Dutch voters and voting since the last decade of the 20th century, volatility which belongs to the highest in the whole of Europe, constantly changes the political majority among voters, and since 2010 within both chambers of parliament. But with what consequences? We discover here an intriguing paradox. Looking from a constitutional perspective, that's to say, in terms of institutional checks and balances, this looks like an ideal situation. Two chambers of parliament able to correct one another and to prevent one another from abuse of power. Isn't this almost an ideal parliament? I have to disappoint you, ladies and gentlemen. From a more political perspective, this situation looks much less positive. As we can see for the second time in history, it makes politics poorly organized and unpredictable. In practice, such different and sometimes contradictory majorities work to the detriment of parliamentary effectiveness and legitimacy. Government is made to a certain degree powerless. Parliament is panicking, especially the second chamber. The population doesn't understand why both chambers are not prepared to work in harmony. Maybe when the system gets used to this reciprocal opposition, there will be found ways to work with it. But until now, I'm not very optimistic. And that brings us right into the heart of this conference. The question of the ideal parliament. As a political scientist, I prefer to observe Parliament and its history from an empirical perspective, and not so much as a primarily philosophical game. So if you allow me, I will not take an empirical frame of reference as a starting point for my remaining argument. Maybe we can thus find some basic insight for our debate tomorrow and on Saturday on the issue of the ideal parliament. Following an analytical framework invented by the British political scientist Anthony King, and further developed by colleagues of mine here and a little bit by myself, I usually describe Parliament as three institutions living together in one institute. The sociological concept of institution is defined as a complex of stable relations with its own values and expectations, its own rhetoric, and its own methods to come to shared conclusions and/or decisions. The question is that three institutions do coexist within one institute called Parliament, but with contradictory values, expectations, and expressions. What makes Parliament, by definition, a quite complicated institute, if you want to understand its behavior and its outcome. Let's go into the details so that I'm able to make myself a bit more clear. First, the most well-known institution in modern Parliament is what I call the arena of party politics and party conflict, mostly leading to more or less stable majorities in favor of government and minorities which build the opposition. There are intense relations with the political parties outside Parliament, and the language is that of ideology. The attitude expected and mostly shown is one of loyalty and support towards the cabinet on one side, as against the criticism of the oppositional representatives on the other side. In the end, the vote will decide, but the result in most cases can be well foreseen. Discussion is not a real exchange of argument with the purpose to convince each other. It's a form of giving account of the party's convictions and the reason for its choices, and to show the weaknesses of the argument of the parties which don't agree. The arena in Parliament is a theatre in which everyone plays his given role more than a forum of real debate. In terms of policy production and predictability, Parliament as an arena is much more advanced than its 19th century predecessor. This didn't know parties, party loyalties, to the effect that no government was able to predict if it would be successful with its law proposals. Interesting to see is that in many advanced democracies, where parties dominate the work of Parliament, the so-called constitutional rights of Parliament have developed into rights of the opposition. They have grown from majority rights into minority rights. A second, much less discussed institution in Parliament is the network of interest representation. Lobby organizations and our friends among the MPs try to influence debate and decision-making to their favor. Sometimes interests converge with party politics. Most political parties once started as organized interest groups, based either on class or religion or ethnic communities. Modern lobbies are characterized by a huge variety of different interests, which don't necessarily correspond with established ideological views. For example, New roads or railways are seldom intrinsically liberal or socialistic by character. In most cases, they are in the special interest of concrete cities and concrete regions. What doesn't make political discussion about them less heavy or emotional? But this whole system of special interest is working in and outside Parliament that puts it sometimes under great pressure. What is important for us to see is that it builds its own system of cross-cutting loyalties in Parliament. And I used to call this Parliament as a marketplace. In a traditional non-ideological Parliament, or a Parliament with relatively limited party political dominance like Congress in the United States or the European Parliament, this marketplace is predominant or is at least of equal importance as the arena. But I think it's important to stress that also in European national parliaments during part of the 19th century, with rather weak parties represented, interest representation in the marketplace was the predominant institution. MPs were primarily the advocates of their cities or regions or their interests. The rise of modern mass parties has, to a certain degree, integrated many different interests in one ideological rhetoric. But parties never succeeded in bringing them under their umbrella completely. An interesting new feature of parliamentary evolution, in my mind, is the gradual decline of the traditional mass parties and their growing incapability of bringing together the actual diversity of interest in society. They are no longer be able to subordinate all of them in one and aggregated political message. Third, every now and then we are able to observe the parliamentary forum as an institution in itself, where the rules and traditions are used for the reasons that brought them into being, the protection of Parliament itself. The causes may differ. Sometimes members of the political majority, mostly groups of frustrated backbenchers, rise up against their own leaders, appealing to their rights as individual MPs and defending individual membership against too much party discipline. Maybe some of you can remember the rebellion of the backbenchers within the British Conservative Party against Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at the end of her career, caused by her proposals for a new poll tax. And there are examples everywhere. The forum not only protects itself against a king or a cabinet, it is also meant to protect individual members against the majority. Another example of the return of the forum is at least as important. Many parliaments are confronted with a growing need among MPs not only to produce new policies, but also to investigate the effects and effectiveness of earlier made decisions. Like an old friend of mine once said, modern parliament is not interested in the future anymore, it's mainly interested in the past. The most spectacular events in this context are what are usually called political scandals, of which most of you will know at least some example in your respective countries. But next to that, we can observe in many countries the growth of committees in and outside Parliament, which investigate the effects of government policies in a broader context. What makes this trend relevant for us is that parliamentary committees which undertake such investigations usually do so on a non-partisan and a non-interest basis. Parliament as a forum retakes its classical rights beyond party loyalty and beyond interest orientation and chooses to behave as an independent forum, if necessary, against the government of the day, as if it were the old king against whom Parliament had to defend its rights. You will not be surprised to hear that the old friend just mentioned was a civil servant at that time working for the Dutch Prime Minister. Every Parliament is three institutions at the same time: arena, marketplace, and forum, partly working as each other's complement, partly conflicting with one another, and making the job of members of parliament, let alone its political leaders, quite complicated. Working within three institutions at the same time is not new. I've tried to show that these institutions can be discovered in every parliament of today and of the past, at least from the moment parliaments had achieved a relevant position in the process of political decision-making in this part of the world. As I said, the job of a professional MP in this configuration of institution is quite complicated, although I have to admit, a bit through personal experience, that it can make the job also very intriguing and a real adventure. MPs have to change positions, arguments and rhetoric according to the situation and depending on what is asked from them. They must be able to change gears like a driver does in his car. Modern parliament is making things the more complicated while the traditionally predominant arena, the party political theatre, is gradually losing ground, suffering from the serious competition of the marketplace and its well-organized lobby organizations. But it is losing ground also against the individual MP and against the restored interest of the forum in investigating government's effectiveness. In this situation, where no institution within Parliament is able to dominate the others, to keep credibility as an MP, as a real people's representative, will be more and more complicated. One can see this observation illustrated by making an analysis of the criticism of most national parliaments in Europe and compare this with the criticism of the European Parliament. National Parliament is often criticized as fully depending on government's initiative and too obedient at the same time. Parliamentary debate seems to deteriorate into quarrels on unimportant incidents and without the power, let alone the authority, to change policies in a meaningful way. Political scientist Vivian Schmidt called this politics without policy. At the other side of the spectrum, the European Parliament is working with much more independence from the European Commission, freely preparing and debating new legislation and the EU budget, and holding the Commission more and more effectively to account. Although the Council of Ministers and the European Council of Government Leaders are not formally bound to Parliament's confidence, they prefer not to get into real conflict with the MEPs. As a forum, vigorously defending and extending its rights, but also as a well-organized marketplace, the European Parliament has grown into an authoritative and highly influential body within the European Union. But no one knows. No one knows. Besides, national parliaments don't want to know, but that's not it. According to the same Vivian Schmidt, the problem of the European Parliament is policy without politics. The EP is no real arena, lacking clear and stable party majorities, which correspond with the political profile of the European Commission, which has no political profile at all. More important, the EP has no majority which really mirrors the preferences of the European electorate. Besides, it lacks, by definition, a clear political opposition apart from some anti-European parliamentary groups. Interesting, the same reviewers who reject the arena in the national context ask for it in the European Parliament, mostly without recognizing the contradictions in their assessment. It doesn't look, ladies and gentlemen, as if we have come any nearer to the definition of the ideal parliament, thanks to this, our empirical analysis. So, what to make of all this? Until now, we have made three pretty inconvenient observations. First, the European Parliament, otherwise a more and more successful institute, is incapable to mobilize massive support because it is not a real arena of party political debate and confrontation. Obviously, a parliament cannot do without profiled political parties and profiled majorities. At the same time, however, there's the second remark, the arena in the traditional national parliament is losing ground. Parties are not able anymore to aggregate all, or at least most, of the issues and trends which are politically relevant. Next to that, we have discovered that the biggest issues of economic growth and social equality are not national questions anymore, and have to be decided upon on an international level, at least on a European level, which is a problem of itself, because the European Union has no profiled and purposive government. It hasn't a real government at all. Third, both developments make the work of national and European Parliament quite difficult, albeit for different reasons. Like I said, national parliaments are busy making politics without policy. The European Parliament is making policy without politics. Parliament needs to be the central arena of real political confrontation to keep its legitimacy among the electors. Citizens must keep their belief that it is not only possible, but that it also makes sense to go to the ballot box, either to support the incumbent political majority or to throw the rascals out, as it is called. Was a democracy the only political system that people are able to change regime without bloodshed, as Sir Karl Popper had put it? But the big question of our time is that it is not sure anymore who or what is thrown out at the day after the general election. We don't know it when we have elected the European Parliament. We don't know it either when we have elected the national parliament, in which the margins for real change have radically diminished over the last decade. The introduction of the euro has drastically limited the freedom of movement in economic and financial politics in every European state. I think it is not too materialistic to suppose that these areas of politics form the essential basis of allocation and distribution in the modern nation state. And this means that in the long run, there will be no other route forward than to gradually bring together most of Europe's economic decision-making in the hands of a real European executive, with the inclusion of fiscal and budgetary headlines. The parliamentary arena of the future should be a European economic arena, a real European representative of the peoples in this part of the world. The political parties will then simply be forced to become European parties with European convictions and principles. The process of upgrading political parties should start now, provided that they want to have a real future. I realize that what I'm saying will be, for some of you, fantasy, dream, and for some more than a question of real expectation, and for some of you it will be a nightmare, especially now that the European Union is not very popular among citizens in Europe, to say the least, and besides in deep economic trouble. Nevertheless, I am deeply convinced that the European Union, having accepted the monetary union, has no alternative anymore. At the same time, I'm convinced that it has made what you could call a great leap forward in terms of integration. The organization of parliamentary democracy has to follow sooner or later. Otherwise, we soon will have an effective European government, but no democracy anymore. Making Parliament bigger than the nation state, of which it is the founder and the product at the same time. This is the great task of all European politicians, who share the belief that there is no way for Europe than to go forward, for the sake of its prosperity, but also for the sake of democracy. There's another side of the matter, Another question with the parliamentary arena in our time. What I mean is this. In the past, British Commons hesitated for a long time before they accepted the entry of television to its meetings. And they were right. People don't like this daily political confrontation. People don't like the theatre delivered by adversary MPs and their aggressive rhetoric. People don't understand the element of sports with winners and losers in parliamentary debate, as if political decision-making were not taken sufficiently seriously. People don't like it in Britain. People don't like it in the whole of Europe. What MPs and journalists see as an ideal parliament, of which question hour is the very apex, that is long, is seen by most people outside parliament as tasteless, bickering, having nothing to do with working in the general interest. Parliament, from the time of its foundation, is a theatre of public account, of ministers towards MPs and MPs towards the general public. Isn't it about time, to realize that the institution of the arena as we have known it until today is an old-fashioned way of giving form to this process of giving and taking account. Maybe it was the right way of doing things as long as there was no real audience in the house, except for the journalists, newspapers, or the radio, who were able to enjoy the game themselves and to translate the language of political conflict in a form which could be understood by the general public. Now that the public itself has entered the room, at least indirectly through the television set or through the internet, the game has lost much of its traditional attractiveness. It has to be transformed if it doesn't want to lose its credibility. It has to be transformed into a new parliamentary institution, a new arena, which can be followed, respected and understood by Parliament's most crucial audience, the electors. But let us not be too pessimistic about the future of Parliament, national and European, as far as this transformation is concerned. The good news is that it already has started. I mentioned already the revival of the investigative activities of many parliaments, the European Parliament not excluded. Like I said, Parliament as an investigator acts as a real authority beyond party and lobby mechanisms needed in other circumstances. In most cases, the Parliamentary Investigation Committee is feared by everyone who has to stand before it when he or she is being heard. And I don't speak only about ministers, but also about CEOs of big firms, high public servants, or army generals. In such a situation, everyone can see who is the highest authority in the room and in the country. In many states, a significant rise in public trust in Parliament can be observed during public hearings of these parliamentary committees. Maybe while these committees are as such non-partisan and make visible that individual members of Parliament are real representatives. Not everyone will be enthusiastic. We know already the opposite reaction. You see, I told you that it was a mess in politics. You hear that in all these hearings. And in most cases, parliamentary investigators are met with much respect. And guess what? Parliamentary hearings are at least as spectacular than fierce confrontations between cabinet and opposition during parliamentary debate. And we all know that Parliament cannot do without theatre, without show. Let's be fair, most of its members like to be re-elected. Let me come to an end and draw two conclusions. First, in a time of transition between declining powers of the nation state and the rise of more cohesive European polity, we will have to accept that no parliament is able anymore to act in an always legitimate and effective way, let alone as an ideal parliament. In a time, second, of declining traditional ideology, Parliament will gradually lose its predominant institution called arena. Let's not be too sad about that, given the old-fashioned way of doing within this arena. Political difference of conviction will not disappear. They are part of the human condition. But they are only part of what Parliament essentially is, and not the most important part anymore. What may come in its place is the predominant institution as Parliament as an independent forum, calling government to account, scrutinizing the effect and the effectiveness of government politics on behalf of the electors, thus acting as real representative of the people. An ideal Parliament, so to say.
Thank you, Joop van den Berg. Thank you very much for your very interesting speech, about which we certainly have to think a bit further. And I'm glad, and I know all attendants here will be, that you will attend the conference on Friday, tomorrow, and so that we might discuss the interesting points you raised. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention at this first evening of our conference, and it now comes to an end. For the staff of this chamber, it's high time to go home. So we are all kindly requested to leave this building. But for those of you who consider it too early to go to the hotel already, there are a lot of nice pubs in the immediate surroundings of the Parliament buildings, of course. And for the others who do leave for their hotels, good night. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your evening. I hope to see you all tomorrow morning around 9:15, as the first session will start at 9:30 exactly. Not here, not in this beautiful building, but in the so-called Nuns House, which might sound a bit peculiar in English, but I can assure you that it's in no way meant to comment on your mental abilities. Not in Dutch simply refers to something of public interest. But in any case, the address is of course in the program of the Nuns House, and this is the most important thing. A final remark, as you probably know already, you can find the abstracts of the various contributions at the website of UParlNet. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all, and till tomorrow.